Hello, this is Bill Nesmith with First Christian Church, Winchester, Kentucky, with the Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Today we will continue our study of the books in the Old Testament that are found in the apocrypha. The book of Judith is our focus for today. It is a story that celebrates a victory of the Hebrews over a foreign power that placed Jerusalem under siege. Judith, a Hebrew widow, is the heroine. Dr. Amy Levine, professor of religion at Vanderbilt University, is a scholar on this book, and she claims that Judith is popular in some circles and readings at the celebration of Hanukkah by the Jews, despite the fact that it's clearly accepted by the Jews and others as fiction. Its popularity, in part, she says, may be that the story has more connections, although fictional connections, that better fit the exploits and the situation faced by the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC, which is the events that are actually being celebrated at Hanukkah in that commemoration. Judith is basically in two parts. Chapters 1 through 7 describe a hopeless military situation for the Jews under a siege of Jerusalem by Assyrians. The king that's mentioned there, the generals and so forth, none of them fit, and at the times that's given, none of that fits history. The second half of chapters 8 through 16 introduces the heroine Judith and tells what she did to save the Hebrew people from the contemplated disaster that they faced. It's a fascinating read. I'd urge you to read it. Judith is a childless widow who is very beautiful. She's wealthy and she's pious. She leaves her home during the siege with only her servant girl and infiltrates the enemy lines all the way to infiltrating the headquarters of the enemy. She captivates the commanding general of the enemy with her beauty. He gets drunk, and Judith recognizes his vulnerability. She decapitates the general with his own sword. She and her servant girl take the head back to her side, where she instructs her village to attack the sieging army, while displaying the head at the front of the army so that it's clearly visible. So she is actually developing the military strategy here too. Think of that. This is a woman, not the traditional Old Testament story of a man directing the army. The enemy flees upon witnessing their commander's head on display. They are pursued by the Hebrews and decisively defeated, saving the people, the temple, and the religious way of life of these Hebrew people. This is a fascinating story, as I said, but it is not supported by history. Several scholars argue it clearly was not intended to be in history, because at the point, especially the theological point, is that God works through the least expected paths sometimes. And it's universally that way, and not just in one specific historical example. So therefore you can write your own example, or you can put up fictitious examples to place the example. That's the route that some scholars go. Just choose any situation and you will see that God works through humans, including women. That's the philosophy here. Judith appears to have never been part of the Hebrew canon, even though it is popular among Jews, and even at the time that the canon was being established. However, it is considered to be canon by the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Christians, but not by Protestants. It was Martin Luther who probably threw the most cold water on this story. He downgraded it in the Christian community especially. Reportedly, he said, Judith is beautiful religious fiction, and so it should be considered. He especially noted that it did not square with the history according to the Old Testament Bible, so it will not be included in my Bible. So Judith has declined in popularity in the last 3 to 4 centuries, especially in Christianity, based on the historical criticism issues for one, but also it fits into a genre of literature that's sort of the Greek romances, and there's moral dilemmas presented here that some people will find offensive. Judith definitely does not fit the Christian ladylike image of the period between 1600 and 1900 when much of that decline occurred. However, in the past few decades, it has gained some popularity. Feminine interest has renewed scholarly studies of this book. More focus is being made towards gleaning the theological messages buried in this story. For example, noting that God works through humans in their own situations and in their own actions, and not just through some miracle or through some famous hero. He doesn't just choose the powerful of the world, but also the downtrodden and helpless, and yes, the females in history. Also noted is how careful Judith, from a theological standpoint, they're pointing out, notice how careful, as you read this, that Judith was to be observant of the Jewish laws of her time. She has prepared food that meets their cultural requirements and religious requirements for the duration of what time she might be over there, and therefore does not consume the food of her enemy, the Gentiles. There is more here than just the reversal of gender roles. As you study Judith, you'll see, however, that this story also is sort of a match for the females of the David versus Goliath story for the males. Now we have a female Judith versus a Goliath-like figure, in which, in both of these cases, they save their people, and the head of their enemy is severed with his own sword. I urge you to read it and ponder the theology that's buried in it.